Nakud everyone. I think we should get started. The first item on our agenda this morning is the ITK election procedures and bylaws. It's tab number 5, but there has been amendment to the election procedures from the package that was sent out. The briefing note, I believe, but to start, if we could have Tania take this, and then Elizabeth might need to provide support along the way as well. But please, Tania, proceed.
Good morning, everyone. So for those of you that were a part of the board call earlier this week, there was an update provided on the from the elections and procedures and bylaws working group. So following direction from the dialogue at the board meeting, the working group has been working on simplifying and consolidating the package of revisions that was circulated in the original package. So there was an updated package, as Natan had referenced, that was circulated last night. To begin, I'll just provide a quick overview. So this working group was tasked, ITK was tasked with convening a working group with regional representatives to address some concerns following the 2018 ITK election. So what I will do to facilitate the discussion of the proposed revisions, I'll begin with the first of 2 parts. I'll go through the proposed amendments to the elections procedures, and then section by section, I'll provide any opening for any questions or comments from all of you, so that everyone's comfortable and understanding of the revisions that have been provided. The second part will be specific to the term of the ITK president and the bylaws. So I will begin now by going through the elections procedures document that was circulated last night. The first provision, and I have left them all highlighted and in bold, the highlights indicate any new or revised text. And I'll begin by the section 1, the chief returning officer responding to direction from the board and AGM to consider a newer function to the chief returning officer that is currently the executive director of ITK. So the new section reads, there shall be 1 chief returning officer appointed by unanimous decision of the board of directors who shall be retained by the corporation, ITK, to manage the election 60 days before the designated voting day. So I'll just pause there if there's any questions or comments on that particular revision. Okay, seeing none, I'll move forward. To the next change is a minor change to section 2.1, which assigns the designated voting day. There was just the inclusion of designated voting added to the original section that is in the existing elections procedures. And at section 3, I will read through. So we would be replacing the existing section 3.1, which currently reads the candidates for the position of president must be Inuit and at least 18 years of age when nominated. The new section would read candidates for the position of president must be at least 18 years of age when nominated, be an Inuit beneficiary of one of the members, all 4 regions identified in brackets, and provide proof of membership by enrollment card or other supporting documentation. I'll pause there if there's any questions or comments on the new provision of 3.1. Seeing none, I will move. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah, when you're saying must be 18 years of age when nominated, an Inuit beneficiary, since we're talking about one candidate, it should be Inuk beneficiary. Any comments from the others? Inuk is singular, Inuit is plural.
Okay, I'm noting the change. Is there any other comments or feedback on the section? Okay, I will then move to section 3.3 sub D. There's language added to the existing provision, which required the nomination of a candidate must be accompanied by a photo, and we've included a valid criminal record check from all provinces and territories resided in within the last 5 years.
Excuse me, Natan or Tania?
Yes?
Yeah, I just have a question in the 3.4. It says the corporation. Does it matter if, when we say corporation, we're talking about ITK, right?
Correct, Andy. The election procedures and bylaws working group has worked to ensure the consistency of language in the ITK bylaws. So the reference to the corporation is ITK.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll move on to the two new sections following 3.3 sub D. The inclusion of a new section stating that a person is disqualified from being a candidate in an election for the office of the president if that person has been convicted anywhere in Canada of an indictable offense or summary conviction offense and whose sentence was completed less than 5 years prior to nomination day.
Sorry, Tania, I was just having a no pun intended, a sidebar discussion. But it's just a question for everybody. I'm going back to section 3, sorry. Do we want to, I want to put the question out there in regards to asking, do they have to reside in Canada? Do we want to have that included in that section or not?
That was not contemplated by the working group as far as I've been involved since 2019, but happy to take any additional suggested revisions from you and the other members.
Is that something that is of interest to the AGM, to put a provision in that the candidate must be a resident of Canada? Or is that not, are there scenarios in which that might exclude people who are going to school or perhaps working for ICC or doing other things internationally?
Would they not still be considered a resident of Canada, even if they're residing in another country for those situations, such as education or on a work trip for an extended period of time?
I think there could be scenarios where a person could not be an official, for tax purposes, a resident of Canada, but still maintain Canadian citizenship and also be a member of a land claim organization. Is this something that we would want to put into the election procedures? Looking for further comment or question on that. Becky?
Yeah, I think the fact that it calls for a beneficiary of the 3 land claims orgs, that explains that. To me, it does.
Well, it's Duane here. I just posed the question because we have a lot of beneficiaries that reside in Alaska. We even have some in Australia. And they're not going to school, but I would think that if they're going to school or on a short-term working thing, they would still be a resident of Canada, yes, if the intention is to come back. But we can entertain this issue at another time. I don't want to slow up the discussion. It was just something that popped up internally with us because one community in Alaska that's very close to us, almost all of that community is also beneficiaries to our land claim.
No, that is a really interesting point. I mean, perhaps we can take this on particular notice for this particular exercise. And if we have to introduce something at another AGM on this particular issue, we can do that. Tania, do you want to proceed?
Sure. So the last new provision that I had gone over was in reference to specific criminal history. And the following provision, if there are no questions or comments there, goes into the fees associated with running for the president's office. So the new clause is the nomination must also be accompanied. This is building on an existing clause, but the nomination must also be accompanied by certified check or money order made payable to ITK, credit card or email transfer in the amount of $500. So this is a bit different than the update that was provided to the board earlier this week. I'll pause for any comments or questions on that section. Duane? Oh.
Sorry, we're having a different discussion again on this, but I wasn't raising my hand, sorry.
Okay, sorry about that. I didn't want to skip over the gesture. Clara?
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. One of the questions I had was, what would the fees be used for? And to change from 200 to 500, that's one of the questions I have. And perhaps, well, I'll let you answer that first before I ask another question. Thank you.
I think that's a great question. As I get later into the procedures, there's also some additional amendments that detail where the deposits and where the deposits are returned to candidates that had participated in the election. It's a fee associated to support the application and to ensure that candidates for the president's office are serious to run in the election, and that there was an interest. This was a specific provision that the working group was tasked to respond to up the fees in order to ensure that only serious candidates were running in the election, and it in regular years when the meetings for the AGM are not held virtually, that it was to avoid also people trying to get free trips to go to different parts in Inuit Nunavut. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay. See no other
I think
questions.
Claire had another question after
Oh,
that.
sorry.
Sorry, just going back to the residency requirement. I just want to ensure that the process in regards to accepting applications were being inclusive of all beneficiaries, regardless of where they live. I think that's one of the situations we're dealing with now in where we are, considering that a lot of people from the Southern Inuit are feeling excluded from any process or accessing any benefits within Inuit organizations. So one of the things I want to bring to the table is that that any procedures we develop or change that we're inclusive and not excluding candidates because they're living outside of Canada or the territory or the regions and so on. So that's one thing I think we need to ensure is that we're inclusive and not excluding anybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Clara. Those are really important points. I hope that the language that's been presented in the earlier section that I referred to, which provides additional detail for beneficiaries to participate in the process, not understanding the complexities of all of the regional organizations and classification of beneficiaries. I hope and I trust that the language is responsive to your concerns.
Thank you. One more question, Natan, is that okay?
Yes.
Or more so of a comment. I think just because I believe that the ITK model will probably be used as well for other Inuit organizations and so on. So I think it's important to ensure that whenever there's a new development of a new process or whatever, then I think we need to remember that could be a model for other Inuit organizations as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Clara. Are there any other comments or questions before I return to the line by line? Okay, seeing none, I will carry on. So the next provision I'll go over is at 3.4. This is building on an existing section. The current section reads, the corporation will provide travel support for candidates to attend the election in person. The new language includes no travel support shall be provided other than to the candidate. The candidate cannot send a designate on his or her behalf. I'll pause there before moving on if there's any comments or questions. Duane?
Yeah, this consideration has come up in the past, and it's damned if we do, damned if we don't sort of thing, because we might end up having 100 candidates run just so that they get a paid trip to go to wherever we're going to have an AGM. That's the worrisome part that I could see happening, because we have had that happen in our own region during our own elections. So I don't know if I would be really supportive of this section just because of that issue and that concern. I'd like to hear what the other regions think in regards to this, because this is probably one of the most serious considerations for amendments right here. It could be thousands of dollars that we're talking about in transportation for these potential candidates.
Duane, the text is that no travel support will be provided.
It says other than to the candidate.
Okay, sorry.
I mean, look at the technology we're using right now. Candidates could always Zoom or Skype or whatever the latest technology is at that time as well to be vetted by the AGM itself or whatever process we're going to end up with at the end of the day.
Yeah, the way it's worded. So my reading this, my understanding is like Duane said, if there's 10 candidates, their travel would be paid for.
Yes, I stand corrected on that. I apologize for that. So it is very clear that the candidate would have travel support to the place of the election. And that is the concern that Duane has raised. So just wondering if what the other perspectives are from, or if it is something that we should change back to just no travel support shall be provided. Johannes?
Natan. I had the same concern that Duane has, and most certainly depending on where the ITK AGM is taking place, and candidates will be attending in person, and depending on where the AGM is taking place, and candidates could be from the other far side, and it could be more than, one or a number coming from the far side, and like doing it could become costly.
Aluki?
Thank you, Natan. I know there was a comment made about what if there were 100 candidates. I wanted to get a sense of how many candidates there usually is, because we don't have that experience here in Nunavut because our elections are for all Inuit. So we don't need to, I guess, consider the travel costs of the candidates because that's part of their campaigning process. I recognize that ITK is very different in a sense. It's like when, as an organization at NTI, we do hiring for our CEO. And I guess I was kind of equating it to that. There's a hiring panel. But when we have a number of people, we're trying to assess whether or not they'd be a good fit for our organization. For a position in that, I guess a senior official kind of senior management position, we would fly them in for interviews. So I was thinking through it in that sense and I know with the last ITK AGM when we selected a person to sit as the president for ITK, I found it very useful to have the person in front of us making a pitch for why they thought they should be in that position, and then the opportunity to ask questions. So I think there's pros and cons to that. But I mean, as I said, we don't have that experience in Nunavut. And if Duane has had that experience where people are putting their name forward with the ability to have that benefit of visiting family, I guess, then that is a concern. And I'm not sure how we go about limiting that, because would we say that because we want it to be fairly equal playing field for anyone who's interested in being in that position. So if we're going to say we're not providing travel support, does that mean we allow people, if they got their own travel support, to be present? Or do we say everyone's going to join by Zoom? So then we have the same technical frustrations and everyone has that same technical frustration, you know? So I think I'm just thinking about the fairness issue. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Aluki. Just from my own experience, which goes back to the late 90s, I don't think there's ever been an election where there have been more than 3 candidates, perhaps 4, but I think that for the most part, it's been between 1 and 4 candidates for the last 6 elections. So we haven't had a scenario where there have been dozens of candidates, but we also have not provided support for candidates to travel until I think the last election. So this is an evolving conversation, and prior to the last election, there wasn't consideration because there just wasn't, there weren't the resources within ITK to support anyone's travel.
Natan?
Yes, Andy?
Yes. I can understand both points. Speaking of either attending or not attending, because first of all, if we are bringing someone, especially in the more remote areas, which tend to be a little bit more expensive, if candidate starts to pile up, yes, the expense can increase pretty fast. I think there's many scenarios that could be put into the candidacy issue. Either it could be treated case by case annually, just depending on how it looks like, or what would need to be dealt with financially or logistically. For sure, to me, with the technology evolving in our days, these days, with the COVID-19, the compromise, and I think there's a lot of learning that has been happening, and of course, there's an issue with the technical difficulties that can happen due to the fact that some of the areas do not have entirely a good internet connection. That would be the only issue. But if we, barring that in the future we have internet problems, I think it can easily be done to have candidates be interviewed through virtual to prevent any problems financially going forward.
Tyler?
Yeah, it's you could see it from either side of it, I think, but it would be good to know, to refresh our memories, what sort of budget ITK works with when they coordinate these elections, how much was spent on travel the last time, if this was the first time that ITK had provided travel support. I also think while a trip from one of our communities to another Inuit region we know is really costly, I think for most people, $500 is no insignificant amount of money to think about putting forward if you have political aspirations. And if somebody is, saying, well, if our fear is that they're using this as a sort of trip, again, I still think that $500 is, with the current suggestion, is enough to make people sort of do a sort of second thought as to filing these papers. But with respect to virtual versus in person, kind of what Aluki has said, it almost has to be either one direction or the other. I would imagine that a lot of people would speak and act differently on one of these meetings or teleconference versus in person, and it's hard to gauge, I think, sometimes whether or not you can support somebody as your leader when you see them virtually or in person. And then there's this other piece of it. Well, if, you know, the rest of the AGM business is going to be scheduled in person and there's a combination, obviously, if the president is running again, then there's always that, you know, again, back to this having a benefit of in person, you know, there's that unfair advantage potentially as well. So it has to be one direction or the other, but I do fear that, you know, some candidates may not be given a fair chance if it was done virtually versus how they would behave or campaign in person.
Becky?
Not to drag this further, but if somebody is like, if a candidate pays the $500, that shows that they're pretty serious. And I'm sure that if they wanted to travel to the site of the AGM or where the election is going to take place, I'm sure they can talk to businesses or, you know, get the travel money. Also, the board gets their bio. That gives you a pretty good idea who's a good candidate. I think we shouldn't be paying for travel. We can also always use, like the last election, you know, even through a phone, speakerphone, we heard what they're running, you know, their campaign promises and all that. So my 2 cents or 1 cent worth.
Yeah, I don't think that there is anything against a candidate raising their own funds to, as a candidate, to then travel. I don't think that it's necessarily demands that they are doing this out of pocket. But as Tyler said, there are scenarios in which an incumbent may have an advantage just by the very nature of being there. So for me, if I'm running an election and I'm already the president, then my way is paid for. So that is a very different scenario than somebody who's wanting to run for president but has to then find $2,000 to $5,000 depending upon where they are and where the AGM is to get there in the room. So it is these are all, there is no right answer, I suppose, because as Duane has correctly said, people can take advantage of it. On the other hand, there are positive reasons for people to be in the room to give their presentation. I'm not sure if we have a consensus either way on this at this moment. What is stated right now, Tania? What do the election procedures say right now?
Specifically on the, sorry, I'm just looking through the document. There's in the existing provisions, there's requirements for the nomination documents and such. There's filing deadlines. There is nothing specific to the travel costs for a candidate.
Okay. Duane, would you prefer that we, since you raised this point, would you prefer that we just keep the text as it's already written and is silent on travel costs?
Or if we can have Tania read that out again, because I'm looking at the old version and I must have the wrong old version in front of me.
So in the existing election procedures under section 3, titled Nomination of Candidates and Withdrawal of Candidates. There's the brief section outlining who's eligible. There's the procedure for nominations, including signatures and supporting documents. There is the details on how to provide the documents and the payment of fees. There are percentages of the deposit to be provided back to certain candidates receiving at least 10% of the votes cast in the election. And there's the acceptance of completed nomination packages.
Just if you could just read out the old wording, or the wording that we have that applies to candidates, and if we provide transportation right now or not, what does that wording say? And I think it's 3.4, but the version I have says that we provide right now.
We did pull the adopted, I'll just clarify the date, adopted February 29th, 2012. The version I have does not state that there's payment associated. So the new section 3.4 that's in front of you is my understanding is the introduction of the providing of travel support for candidates. And then there was some additional language provided over the last few months with the working group to specify that no designate could be sent and provided travel support.
I think we should just table this and continue with the process that we have right now, and have more consideration on this specific item within the bylaws in the future, because it's either that or we change it and then we see what happens. So we're gonna get it's a no-win situation either direction we go on this subject, but we're trying to look for the best candidates, and that's why the bylaw also says that it's in the best interest of the four bodies to nominate people if they so choose as well. Because we would know those potential candidates the best ourselves and the best interests of the overall organization. So I would prefer that we just kept it as it is at this time.
So just for a path forward on 3.4 in the document that you've received most recently, why don't we just say if we are going to pass a resolution today that 3.4 would be struck from that, so that it would be silent on the travel support for candidates in the revisions that we are considering today, and that we work in the coming year to figure out if there is a way to do this that meets all of the considerations.
Okay, I've made note of that, and we can also, if there is a decision to vote on the resolution, we can add any additional details.
Please proceed.
So the next highlighted section underneath the now deleted section is the reference to deposits. So the introduction of language that the deposit shall be returned to the elected candidate or any candidate who has received at least one vote at the end of the election. So I'll pause there if there's any further questions or comments on this change. Seeing none, I will then move to section 3.6. This is an existing section that has been amended or proposed amendments to include the reference to the new criminal record check provision. So it would now read completed nomination papers, pictures, criminal record check from all provinces and territories resided in within the last 5 years, and deposits must be received by the chief returning officer by the closing date for nominations. Late nomination papers will not be accepted. Are there any questions or comments on this provision? Crystal?
Thank you. I'm curious to know, I thought when you get a criminal record check that it comes directly from RCMP. Do provinces and territories have their own that's separate from the, because if it's a criminal record, it should be within the Canadian justice system, right?
Thanks, Crystal. It's actually a great question and something that the working group was discussing yesterday. So we have the understanding from one of our working group members who had previously worked in the Crown Criminal Office and was able to clarify for us the requirements for criminal record checks for candidates would be preferable from all provinces and territories that they have resided. We've set the bar at the 5 years because it reflects the criminal record section, basically because there would be an inability to know if someone, say, had lived in Ontario, had some offenses and then moved to another jurisdiction, and they did a criminal record check and say, in Quebec, that they actually, the system wouldn't recognize the criminal history in the other province. So it's actually not a seamless process. So this provision was added to protect around the full picture on someone's criminal history in the places of residence for the last 5 years. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, it does. But what about fingerprints? Because if you do fingerprints, then that's attached to your record, regardless of province or territory that you reside in. Is that correct as well?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that level of detail, just understanding that the nature of the requirement for these new criminal record checks to ensure that we're having an accurate picture of the individual's criminal history, we would want to set the bar at looking to all provinces and territories of residence to ensure that all of the information was valid, as there's concerns that they're not always shared in terms of across jurisdictions. Are there any other questions or comments on this section? Becky?
Yes, I've had this experience when I was working with district education authorities. A criminal record check comes back as saying this person may or may not have criminal record. So if a candidate's criminal record comes back saying that person may have a criminal record, so is it up to the board to ask the candidate what that criminal record is for? And is it up to the candidate to disclose if they're that serious about running? Thank you.
If that scenario played out, there would be the requirement to meet the rule under the new elections procedures as proposed amended for the individual to divulge to ensure that they're not in contravention of the earlier section that I had referenced, that a person would be disqualified from being a candidate in the election if they had been convicted anywhere in Canada of an indictable or summary conviction and the sentence was completed less than 5 years ago. So they would need to demonstrate that they were playing within that rule or not, because that's the determination for the disqualification. Does that help to answer your question? If there aren't any other comments or questions, I'll just pause. Okay, I will then move on. So the next section with new language proposed is at section 6. The manner of voting section, there is an existing 6.1 clause that states the current president shall preside over the election unless the president is a candidate. Otherwise, the vice president will preside over the election. So the added language, proposed language highlighted would include where both president and vice president are candidates, the member representatives present may choose any individual who is present at the AGM to act as chair and preside over the election. So this would deal with if you have both your president and vice president happen to run in the same election. So just some clarity around who may preside over the meeting. Seeing no questions or comments, I'll then move to 6.6. The existing provision details that the chief returning officer shall provide candidates a 10-minute opportunity to address delegates. There's new language added and a 10-minute question and answer period, and candidates shall not be present for the presentations of other candidates. Seeing and hearing no questions or comments, I'll move to the next line, which is a new provision to further go into the procedure of the presentations and Q&A. The new section would read, unless a member directs otherwise, the chair may allow for an extension to the question and answer period where necessary. Are there any questions or comments before I move on?
Yeah, Tania.
Yes, Andy?
Yes, for section 6.6.
Mm-hmm.
The second part that says unless a member, there's a word missing. It has to say unless a member representative directs.
Thanks, Andy. I've noted the correction to ensure consistency with the bylaws. I understand that's where your comment's coming from.
Yep.
Is there any other comments or questions?
No.
Thank you. So then I'll move noting at 6.9. We've removed a reference to the candidates with highest number of votes shall be declared the winner, because there's additional sections that are identifying some additional detail on the votes and percentages. So the new provisions proposed, first, any delegate or candidate may request a count of the votes received by each candidate. The next line, the candidate who receives more than 50% of eligible votes cast, in brackets a majority, shall be declared the winner. And third, if no candidate receives more than 50% of eligible votes cast, voting will proceed in accordance with Section 7. Are there any questions or comments on these lines? Seeing none, I will move on to Section 7, which goes into more detail from those 3 lines. So the existing elections procedures at 7.1 had made a reference to the term of the president, and the working group has provided a separate amendment in the bylaws that I will go over next on the next item of this of the review. So the proposed change is to remove the reference to the 3-year term, and the section would remain the same otherwise. So the 7.1, the president shall be elected by a majority vote of valid votes cast by the vice president and the members as represented through their delegates to the AGM. I'll pause there before going on if there's any comments or questions. So I'll go into the last 2 sections, will bring us to the end of the review here, but just to note that this piece at 7.2 and introducing a new 7.3 has been an ongoing dialogue with the working group members over the course of the last day and a half. So I will present the text that's in your package. Understanding that some of you may have some comments and questions, as this would replace the existing section 7.2, which deals with percentages of votes and how to declare the winner. So the new section 7.2 would read, subject to section 7.3, so a new section, if there are more than 2 candidates for the position of president and none of the candidates receive more than 50% of the votes, the candidate who has received the fewest votes shall be removed from the list of candidates. Subsequent votes will then be conducted for the remaining candidates, and the candidate who receives more than 50% of the votes shall be elected. The second paragraph reads, if no candidate receives more than 50% the votes during the second round of the subsequent votes, then the process of eliminating candidates where applicable and subsequent votes as outlined above shall continue until such time as one candidate receives more than 50% of the votes. Understanding that's a complicated section, I'll just pause there if there's any questions or comments before I move into the new section 7.3. Becky?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if the term is extended to 4 years, what happens if that president is not working out at all? Would there be no confidence vote, or is there a provision how the board would oust that president?
It's a great question, Becky. There's actually provisions in the existing ITK bylaws that outline the procedure to follow by the board if there is that type of scenario with an elected president and other directors of the board.
Thank you. I should read my bylaws more closely for you.
Hi, it's Colin here. Just a comment on my observation of this procedure here. I take it it's only board members that are eligible to vote? Or is there something missing here that I'm missing?
The procedure for votes at the AGM for president are detailed in the existing bylaws, and if you will bear with me, I can reference to you specifically. The rules for voting with at an AGM in an election is provided for at I believe it's in section 8, where as in this AGM, you have the ability for delegates to provide comments and such. However, the rules around an AGM where there is an ITK election, the ability for delegates, or sorry, powers for the delegates would extend towards the voting towards the president of ITK. Sorry, I don't have the specific section to reference.
In the existing election procedure, all members of the annual general meeting, member representatives, have one vote, and that also does include the Inuit Circumpolar Council Canada president. So there are 13 eligible voters, 3 from each of the 4 land claim regions, and then the ICC Canada president.
Okay, thank you.
Natan?
Andy, yes, go ahead.
Yes. Tania, I understand the committee considered putting a wording for in case of a tie in the 7.2 section. Was there any changes to that applied?
Thanks, Andy. As I mentioned at the top of the item, in my introductory comments, we've still been receiving emails, emails exchanged between the working group members up until this morning. So I have presented the revisions that were circulated to the board. As I'm unable to track where everyone's at. There's been a number of discussions back and forth about adding an S here and there. So I'm sorry, Andy, if there was any, I'd asked the working group if it was possible for any clarification or additional revisions that would be brought through the delegates, because it's been difficult to track the last minute wordsmithing. Are there any additions or revisions that Makivik has to bring forward at this time?
Nothing more than that. But I believe that we do have a wording.
Right, but Andy, if I could jump in here. In section 7, there's been extensive wording that is highlighted in yellow that was in an email that was sent out this morning on 7.2 and 7.3 A and B, where there is a very detailed scenario of how to get to a scenario in which a president is elected by more than 50% of the vote of the eligible member representatives.
Okay.
Becky?
And Natan?
Oh, sorry, Andy?
Yes. Can I have one to make her point on this?
No.
Just give her a chance to say something.
No, I'd rather we have a conversation of the AGM.
Okay.
Becky?
Natan, you said all members have a vote at the election. Pauktuutit and youth presidents don't have a vote.
Yeah, I misspoke. I'm sorry. I apologize for that.
Are there any further questions or comments on this section before I move to the new 7.3? Seeing none. So the introduction of a new 7.3 reads as follows: in the event of a vote where no candidate receives, in the event of a vote where First instance, no candidate receives more than 50% of the votes. Second instance, 2 or more candidates tie for the lowest number of votes. And in third, there is only 1 candidate remaining in addition to the tied candidates. Then subsequent votes shall be held with all of those candidates on the ballot until such time that either of the following occurs first. A, one of the candidates has received more than 50% of the votes, or B, there are 2 or more candidates remaining in addition to the tied candidates, at which time the candidate or candidates with the lowest number of votes will be removed, and subsequent votes will then resume under section 7.2 for the remaining candidates. Are there any comments or questions on the section 7 amendments? Okay, seeing none.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Duane.
Yeah, I just want to point out that we're happy with this section ourselves. Our legal counsel has been a part of the working group with Tania, so I know the time they've spent on this over the last year, roughly. So it's pretty clear to us in regards to this section and the process that would evolve in those scenarios. So thank you for that work putting into that, all of it actually, Tania.
Okay, seeing no further comments or questions, and thank you, Duane. Appreciate the acknowledgement. All of the working group members have been very helpful and appreciate the work we've been able to achieve over the course of the past year since I've been involved. Understanding the work started following the 2018 election. So in terms of the elections procedures, that is the extent of the proposed revisions. There is a resolution that's been prepared, and there's also a second item under the bylaw and elections procedures review that I can get into next.
Yes, Tania, if you could just go through the one amendment to the ITK bylaws that also is under consideration. They are a little bit of a package deal with the election procedures. And then we will proceed to entertain the 2 resolutions associated with this item.
Natan, Stanley here.
Yes, Stanley?
Yeah, wasn't there another one that was the discussion was to extend the term from 3 years to 4 years?
Yes, Stanley. The next item on the bylaws, that is the only consideration of change of the ITK bylaws, is the extension of the term of president.
Oh, okay, it's not part of the, okay, I got it. Thanks.
Tania?
Sure.
Natan.
So, sorry.
Yes, Andy?
I do have a wording for 7.2.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
Okay. After the wording continuing receive more than 50% of the votes, this new one is that the candidates who has received the fewest votes shall be removed from the list of the candidates, except that in the case where there is a tie for fewest votes, subject to section 7.3, the tied candidates shall be removed from the list of the candidates. And that continues subsequent votes.
Thank you for that clarification. It's a very technical clarification, and it seems to make complete sense with the rest of the section 7.2 and 7.3. Are there any concerns in relation to introducing that additional wording from Makivik? I'm not seeing any concerns. So when we consider the resolution, we will consider that that amendment to the yellow text that we have in front of us. Tania?
Okay, thank you. So the second item in your package, labeled as Appendix 2, it's the existing ITK bylaws. And in response to the board direction and dialogue at previous AGMs, there was an interest to extend the term of the ITK president from the existing 3-year term to 4 years. So at section 8.2 sub 1 in the existing ITK bylaws, there's a quick and short amendment replacing the section I will read with new wording. The president shall be elected at the annual meeting of members for a term of 4 years by a majority vote of the vice president, member representatives, and delegates, each of whom shall have 1 vote for this purpose. And that is the only proposed amendment for this change. Just to outline the procedures for amendments to the bylaws, it's before you at the AGM, as the bylaws require that any changes or amendments to the bylaws or repeal are voted on at the AGM in order to correct them and make them effective. Are there any questions or comments on the final revision in your package? Okay, thank you very much for all of your feedback. And
Natan, Stanley here.
Please go ahead, Stanley.
Yeah, it just in regards to that the term, I think it's important that the AGM delegates support the extension. Doing a 3-year term is very short. By the time you get the whoever's new to the organization or whatever, get familiar with the organization, their term is just about to end and they're not moving things forward. So I think a 4-year term would be suitable for this position. Taima.
Thanks for that, Stanley. Is there any other? Are there any other interventions on this particular point before we entertain resolutions? Johannes?
Natan, I support what Stanley is saying, and having experienced position of president of Nunatsiavut government, and it takes a couple of years to get a handle on what you're doing, and the 3rd year you're just finally starting to learn more about what it is that you have to do, especially with being a board member of the ITK, and so I support what Stanley is saying on a 4-year term for ITK president. Nakamik.
Nakamik, Johannes. And to be completely clear, is my interpretation of this that the amendment to this bylaw would then be introduced into reality in the next election. So that my particular term is 3 years, as it was when it started, and that the election for is due at the next AGM in 2021, and the amended term of the president would go into effect at the beginning of the next term. That is the interpretation that I think everyone has within the amendment process. And I just wanted to be clear to everyone that that is my understanding of it.
Natan?
Yes, Andy?
Thank you. Thank you. For the previous discussion regarding the election procedures, I think that was a more technical side of the bylaws, and for this particular change in the term of the position of the ITK president, there is the from the Makivik side a little bit more different approach to this because I understand there has been a request for a retreat among the board of directors to discuss a couple of things regarding the ITK, and not just the ITK, it's also an opportunity to have some lengthy talks among the leaders of 4 different regions in regards to the federal relations, the self-governments, and along the big items that all the regions have interest in. That particular amendment that is being presented was also in question because of it was deemed that it was important to have the discussion among the board of directors at first. And unfortunately, because of the COVID, this retreat has yet to happen. And that being said, for the Makivik side, regarding this change, it was never discussed after with the ITK or among others, because there was a belief that eventually there will be a retreat. That's why it has not been discussed. And with that being said, it is still being hoped that this amendment would be postponed until next time, and have eventually the retreat that has been waiting for a while. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Duane, did you have your hand up?
I didn't, but I was talking with Jerry here, but I was just explaining that my understanding is each of the 4 regions' legal representatives have worked this out, and that we did not need to wait for a retreat. That was the direction from my legal counsel as of yesterday. It was resolved. And from what I'm hearing from others around the table, there's general support for this. We can always revisit this at a later date. We have discussed this internally in regards to 3 to 4 years, and it just makes more sense to us that it should be 4 years, because it's more in synergy with all of the most of the other organizations, as well as the other bodies such as the federal government that ITK would have to work very closely with. Normally it's 4-year elections for that as well. So it just makes sense for there to be trying to make that process more consistent with other bodies, so that the relationships could be built up and strengthened over that time period. So we're supportive of what's being proposed in the bylaw amendments as they are. Thank you.
Thank you, Duane. Are there any other comments before I get into the resolution process?
Stanley here again.
Yeah, please, Stanley, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think it's the AGM members that can only make the amendment to the bylaws. So and we're at this stage where the AGM is taking place to make changes. To prepare ourselves for next year's elections coming up. That'll kick in, like you mentioned, the 4-year term if it's approved by the membership, and then go from there. Because it's just like I mentioned before, it's difficult for a new member going in, not knowing what they're walking into really, and so I think a 4-year term would be more comfortable for the board to work with, because they're very, the ITK works very closely with the federal government, dealing with issues of all the Canada's northern region. So yeah, I'm in support of the 4-year term, dealing with it now.
Makivik Stanley. If there are no other comments, I'll introduce the first resolution in relation to the ITK election procedures. It's important to know exactly what we are resolving to, or what we are deciding upon. And so the summary of changes to the document that was sent this morning, I think, is important just to be very clear on. Tania, if you can give us clear changes from the document that was distributed this morning and has in yellow the changes to the existing ITK election procedures.
Sure. So I noted 3 changes to the document before you all. The first change was noted in the proposed changes at section 3.1, so the new 3.1 replacing Inuit with Inuk. The second change noted was the removal of proposed section, sorry, let me just pull through here. Sorry, proposed
3.4.
section 3.4, thank you. This removes the reference to the travel supports provided for candidates. And the third change noted would have 7.2 read as follows. If there are more than 2 candidates for the position of president and none of the candidates receive more than 50% of the votes, the candidate who has received the fewest votes shall be removed from the list of candidates, except that in the case where there is a tie for fewest votes, subject to section 7.3, the tied candidates shall be removed from the list of candidates. Subsequent votes will then be conducted for the remaining candidates, and the candidate who receives more than 50% of the votes shall be elected.
Those are the total of amended changes. And the resolution reads, whereas the ITK bylaws and election procedures working group has conducted a review of the ITK bylaws and election procedures, whereas the recommendation of amendments to the ITK elections procedures are adopted by the annual General Assembly, therefore be it resolved that the ITK members hereby approve the ITK election procedures. I ask for a motion to approve.
I'll make the motion.
Okay, Gerald, and the seconder, Aluki. Can I see all in favor of the amendments resolution? Aluki, Gerald, Johannes, Duane, Gerald again, Clara, Tyler, and then on the phone, Stanley.
I approve.
Okay, and on the phone, we have Colin. Colin, we have.
Natan, I approve.
Okay, thank you, Colin. And then Andy Pirti.
I abstain.
Okay, Samantha David.
Natan, they are unable to speak. They've chosen to use the listen only line. They're able to hear but not speak.
Okay, Samantha and Lillian both, it would be great to have their votes in, just to be able to close off the.
I will connect with them by email.
Okay.
Natan,
Yes.
I think, is this about the elections changes? That one is I approve.
Okay. Thank you, Andy. I appreciate that. Yes, this is about the election procedures. And then we will follow up with Lillian and Samantha.
Natan?
Yes.
I'm getting word because I'm able to communicate with the other two delegates through text that they approve.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So the resolution carries. Thank you very much for all of your hard work. The next resolution is in relation to the amendment to the ITK bylaws. Whereas the ITK bylaws requires any amendments to the ITK bylaws confirmed by members at an AGM by resolution. Whereas the ITK bylaws and election procedures working group has conducted a review of the ITK bylaws and election procedures. And whereas the recommendation of the amendment to the ITK bylaws are adopted by the annual general assembly, therefore be it resolved that the ITK members hereby approve the ITK bylaws as amended. And that is specific to the one change from the term of the president from 3 years to 4 years. Can I get a motion to approve?
Stanley, move.
Thank you. Can I get a seconder, please? Johannes Lampe, seconds. All in favor? Aluki, Gerald, Johannes, Duane, and Gerald, Clara, Tyler, and then again on the phone, Colin.
I approve.
Okay, and then Andy Pirti.
Yes, this time I abstain.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm getting word that same for Sam and Lillian.
Okay, thank you for that. The amendment to the ITK bylaws has been approved as well. Thank you so much for bearing with us. That was an hour and a half of very technical bylaw revision. Thanks so much, Tania, for your work, and then also all of the legal support from Inuit leadership for that. It's now 12:35 Eastern. I'd like for us to take a 20-minute break. And well, actually, we'll just come back at 1 p.m. So 25 minutes to grab some lunch or a snack or just to stretch your legs. And we will come back at 1 p.m. for tab number 6, an act respecting First Nations, Inuit and Métis children, youth and families discussion. Nakumik, everyone, please stay on the line, mute yourself and turn off your cameras if you'd like, but please stay on the line and we'll reconvene in 25 minutes.